Early history of Islam in America. The backdrop. Muslims in the USA emerged in the backdrop of various historic periods and events, starting with the pre-Columbus landings of Muslim traders, which have mainly remained obscure from the public historic records. The following major historic events and periods, factors and players constitute the backdrop of early Muslim history in the USA. Systematic European colonization began in 1492 by the landing of Italian explorer Christopher Columbus in the Caribbean and continued into the coming centuries with the main purpose of finding gold at the expense of lives of millions of Native Americans. Slave trade in America began in the 1530s by Spanish conquistadors and by the British in August 1619. The peculiar institution officially ended on December 6, 1865, by the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, out of 12.5 million Africans who were shipped, about 10.7 million survived the dreaded Middle Passage, disembarking in North America, the Caribbean, and South America. Yet the actual number of enslaved Africans may be 5 to 10 times more, as the slave trade database does not account for the numbers bred like animals after the U.S. government's 1807 ban on importation, or those clandestinely and illegally transported to the Western Hemisphere. After centuries of being treated as property and tortured by whips, carpenter's tools, chains, cotton presses, hackles, handsaws, hoe handles, iron or branding livestock, nails, pokers, smoothing irons, singletrees, steelyards, and tongs, many but not all Africans were freed after the Emancipation Proclamation. It is estimated that at least 20 to 30% of the slaves brought to North America were Muslims. Most were forced to convert to Christianity. Black churches, specifically African Methodist Episcopal, AME, and Baptist, gave spiritual, religious, and material sustenance to African American communities during and after slavery. Historically, black churches such as Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, where Dylann Roof massacred 9 African Americans in a Bible study class, helped sustain communities against the ravages of Jim Crow, poverty, and racial violence that savaged African American life during this period. Masonic lodges and the unchurched. Just like the white church, the black church had membership requirements. Many freed slaves and other poor blacks found themselves unwelcomed in the church, as there was a sense of social hierarchy based on one's background and social status. Then there were others who did not find church appropriate for various reasons. Many such found themselves welcomed in the black lodges, where they experienced a friendly social environment and economics. Then there were Ahmadiyya missionaries, who first arrived in America in 1920. Their leader, Mohammed came from England to initiate the group's propagation mission. The Ahmadiyya used their English translation of the Quran, Muhammad Ali translation, to present their false ideology of Islam as Islam. Anyone who does not believe in Arabian prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, as the final prophet of God is not a Muslim, regardless of what they do and call themselves. In the USA, Ahmadiyya missionaries were prolific in calling others to their false version of Islam, especially to African Americans. Many early prominent African American jazz musicians in New York accepted what they thought to be Islam through the Ahmadiyya and joined them. As the true teachings of Islam became known to people in the lodges and also in the Ahmadiyya organization, many converted to Islam. Then there was Moorish Science Temple, which was first established in Newark in 1913 by Timothy Drew from North Carolina, who changed his name to Noble Drew Ali, 1886-1929. The organization was recreated in Chicago in 1919. Instead of using the actual Holy Quran, Drew Ali introduced what became known as the Circle 7 Quran, a combination that included his ideas, Masonic teachings, passages from the Aquarian Gospel, and Eastern religions. The temple observes its Sabbath on Fridays and prayers are performed standing facing east. As far as food is concerned, Drew Ali forbade consumption of meat and intoxicants. Beards were prescribed for men. The Star of David, Crescent and Star, and the Masonic Compass were introduced into the literature and rituals. One primary tenet of the Moorish Science Temple is the belief that African Americans are descendants of ancient Moabites and Canaanites with historical lineage descending from Morocco and Egypt. He thus taught that blacks are Asiatics, and that would help them come out of mental and economic slavery. Temple membership was divided into 2 clans, identified by suffix names of El and Bey. The El clan members wore a green fez, while the Bey clan wore a red fez. They greet each other with Islam or peace, along with a gesture of two raised fingers and right hand across the chest, which is associated with the Masonic greeting. Drew Ali claimed to be a prophet and presented himself as a collective embodiment of all prophets based on the prevailing beliefs and customs of various religions. However, even though Noble Drew Ali used his self-prescribed religion, his approach was racial, and his organization was similar to Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. In 1929, Noble Drew Ali was charged for the murder of a high-ranking member, Claude Green, and was jailed. After being released on bail, he disappeared and was presumed by law enforcement officials and many past and present members of the Moorish Science Temple to have been killed by organizational rivals. Contributions and successes. Initiated an organized response to a violent color-based racial caste system of that time in the American society. His temple was the spearhead of several movements and organizations for African Americans. Some converted to the true Islam, while others remained cults. Next, let's talk about the Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad. Nation of Islam, NOI, was founded in 1930, Detroit, Michigan, by Wallace Fard Muhammad, who may be an Arab, with Arabic name Ulai Fardi Ahmed. He was in office for a short period of time during 1934, and was succeeded by Elijah Muhammad, who remained the leader until his death in 1975. Elijah was born in 1898 in Sandersville, Georgia, about 14 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. His birth name was Elijah Robert Poole. NOI emerged as the foremost national separatist organization for African Americans with followers in every major city. Nation of Islam theology is based upon the belief that Fard's teaching of Elijah Muhammad was fulfillment of Scripture regarding God's teaching of an apostle, where Fard is described as God in person, the Messiah, and the Mahdi. They state, "We believe that Allah, God, appeared in the person of Master W. Fard Muhammad, July 1930, the long-awaited Messiah of the Christians and the Mahdi of the Muslims." Contributions and successes of the NOI. Even though slavery was legally abolished in the United States in 1865, Jim Crow laws assured that the social and material condition of most African Americans remained virtually the same. In such an environment, entered one of the few organizations that appealed to the masses of black people, the Nation of Islam. From a social justice perspective, the NOI helped to elevate the self-esteem and self-worth of thousands of Africans in the United States and throughout the diaspora. The organization introduced Islamic terms and pseudo-Muslim traditions to a nation heretofore unacquainted with the religion of Islam. After the death of Elijah Muhammad in 1975 and the ascension to the leadership of his son, Wallace Muhammad, a large percentage broke away from the group's racist and anti-Islamic teachings and came into the fold of true Islam. That is an extraordinary communal achievement. Due to its strict discipline and entrepreneurial vision, NOI achieved a significant economic success, and by the mid-1960s, it had about 100,000 followers. NOI took the victims of slavery and torture and made them successful merchants and businessmen. It worked separate from the white America and established black capitalism. The 10 ministries of NOI and their short and long-term impact on blacks in the society is worth appreciation and further study. NOI came as an aggressive defender against the extreme and unprecedented evils committed by the whites of America. Its founders used a peculiar form of race-based theology and thus became a race-based ideological movement. With the passage of time, while a significant segment came into the fold of true Islam, the rest have retained their original doctrine and name. It appears that Elijah Muhammad's son, W.D. Muhammad, was exposed to Sunni Islam since his childhood. He was a vocal critic of his father's teachings, resulting in multiple suspensions from the organization. W.D. Muhammad was also a friend and confidant of Malcolm X and was in exile from the NOI at the time of Malcolm's martyrdom on February 21, 1965. Now let us talk about a historic figure, Edward Wilmot Blyden. Edward Wilmot Blyden, the 3rd of August 1832, the 7th of February 1912, considered as the father of Pan-Africanism, was an educator, writer, diplomat, and politician primarily in Liberia. It is in that context that he is being mentioned here as a person, and not as a movement. Born in the West Indies, Blyden was brought to the United States by a prominent white Presbyterian minister who wanted Blyden, because of his exceptional intellect, to study to become a minister. Blyden's freedom was constantly jeopardized by slave catchers who attempted to kidnap him and force him into bondage. He joined with other free black immigrants from the United States and migrated to the West African country of Liberia, established by the American Colonization Society in 1822 for free blacks. He taught for 5 years in the British West African colony of Sierra Leone in the early 20th century. His writings on Pan-Africanism were influential in both colonies. Sierra Leone and Liberia were founded during the slavery years for the resettlement of free blacks from Great Britain and the United States. His major work, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race, 1887, promoted the idea that Islam was more unifying and fulfilling religion for Africans than Christianity. He argued that the latter was introduced to and forced upon enslaved blacks by European colonizers. He believed it had a demoralizing effect, although he continued to be a Christian and died as Christian. However, he thought Islam was more authentically African, as it had been brought to sub-Saharan areas by people from North Africa. Edward Wilmot Blyden was one of the first non-Muslim academics to delineate the much greater compatibility of Islam and African culture than Christianity and African culture. He decried the insistence of Christian missionaries that Africans adopt Western cultural expressions like styles of dress and worship rituals, while renouncing African culture as primitive. Blyden praised the emphasis that Islam places on education and learning. Blyden's praise of Islam and knowledge of Islam was so great that many Christian theologians believed that Blyden had secretly embraced Islam. Blyden was one of the foremost proponents of Islam and Pan-Africanism on the African continent. Imam Warith Deen Mohammed, born in 1933 and passing in 2008, was the 7th son of Elijah Muhammad. It is believed that as a teenager, he was privately tutored by true Muslims. He went through internal conflicts with not only his father but also with Louis Farrakhan and others within the Nation of Islam. He was appointed by his father as his heir to the leadership of the Nation of Islam in 1975. It is then that he launched a movement to change the Nation of Islam and its beliefs to be true Islamic beliefs. He was assisted by Muhammad Ali in attracting others to the organization. Imam Warith Deen Muhammad's pursuit of facilitating true Islamic education for hundreds of his followers was heightened when he sent a few hundred leaders of the organization to perform Hajj. He established connections with other immigrant Muslim leaders and organizations, especially MSA and ISNIA. Imam W.D. Muhammad traveled throughout the country, wherever his followers lived, to help them learn the true teachings of Islam. There is arguably no one in the history of America who brought a comparable number of people into the fold of true Islam in such a relatively short period of time. Then the Immigration Act of 1965 caused the USA Muslim population to increase from 200,000 in 1951 to over 1 million in 1971. These immigrants had not come in as missionaries. They had, instead, by and large, come to the USA looking for better educational and economic opportunities. Another organization, Dar-ul-Islam, is regarded as the first civil rights-era Sunni national movement. The Dar-ul-Islam movement grew out of the Brooklyn-based State Street Mosque. The State Street Mosque was established in 1939 by Grenadian Sheikh Daoud Faisal. Founders of the Dar-ul-Islam movement, the Dar, regularly attended the State Street Mosque before leaving to establish the Dar in 1962. Headquartered in Yasin Mosque on Herkimer Place in Brooklyn, the DR thrived as a national organization with chapters in the Caribbean. The membership of the Dar was based on Bay'ah, pledge of allegiance to the national emir through Bay'ah to local emirs. The organization was based on the leadership's understanding and literal interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah. The organization's men wore mostly traditional or modified versions of Arab garb and followed a literal interpretation of the Sunnah. Imam Yahya served from 1968 until 1979 when the movement was taken over by Pakistani mystic Sheikh Mubarak Ali Jilani. Founded in 1980 as Al-Fuqara and later named Muslims of America, Sheikh Jilani's movement effectively dismantled the movement, splitting the DR's membership between loyalists to Sheikh Jilani and those committed to the original mission of the Dar. Of those refusing to follow Jilani, Imam Al-Amin Abdul Latif, longtime Dar member in New York, headed the northern wing of Al-Ummah, the new name for the former Dar-ul-Islam movement. Imam Jamil Al-Amin, founder of the Community Masjid in Atlanta and member of the Dar movement since his Shahada in 1971, was named the Southern leader of Al-Ummah. The Brooklyn-based Dar-ul-Islam movement, in conjunction with its renamed successor, Al-Ummah, is the first African-American Sunni organization to organize and sustain chapters across the United States for over 5 decades. Members of the organization practiced a strict interpretation of Sunnah, which they believed to be appropriate in the American context. DR members were a visible alternative for black community residents to the bow tie-wearing men of the Nation of Islam. For decades, immigrant Muslims were not easily identifiable as Muslims in the streets and neighborhoods of this country. The organization encouraged entrepreneurship among its members, resulting in the establishment of many businesses throughout the country. Individual members also started cottage industries like making, packaging, and selling incense and oils on the streets and in other public venues. The Dar-ul-Islam was the first Sunni Muslim organization to establish and maintain a decades-long prison program, especially in New York. Hundreds, if not thousands, of shahadas were administered in the nation's jails and prisons at the hands of Dar volunteers. To a certain degree, the Dar failed to fully incorporate the Muslim intelligentsia into its leadership structure and membership. The group was characterized by many as having an anti-intellectual approach to incorporating new ideas and approaches. The DR created a generational issue through its wide practice of polygyny. Too many took multiple wives and had many children without having the capacity to take care of their financial, material, or emotional needs. Another entity, the Islamic Party, established comprehensive constitutional methodology. The Islamic Party was a homegrown Islamic movement in North America from 1971 to 1980, and as the Islamic Party and Islamic People's Movement in Central America and the Caribbean from 1980 to 1991. Its founder, Yusuf Muzaffaruddin Hamid, was an aspiring jazz musician who got exposed to Islam through his interaction with African-American jazz musicians in New York City, and the literature of Ahmadiyya movement, which, along with the doctrine of the Nation of Islam, was the only version of Islam systematically propagated nationally to African Americans in the 1960s. He embraced Islam at the age of 17. He then studied Islam extensively, voraciously reading any available English language material within his grasp. From 1965 to 1969, Muzaffaruddin traveled throughout the Muslim world. He met numerous leaders of the Islamic movement in Egypt, Malaysia, Tunisia, Pakistan, and West Pakistan before the establishment of Bangladesh. While in Pakistan, Muzaffaruddin was a houseguest of Maulana Abul Ala Maududi. He then launched a dawah effort and gathered anyone he could. In 1969, Masjidul Ummah was established by Muzaffaruddin and other local Muslims in a 3-story house near Howard University. Muzaffaruddin was elected the Imam of the newly established masjid. Muzaffaruddin returned to the United States with the intention of establishing an Islamic movement like what he had seen in Pakistan and Egypt. But the concept of Islamic movement had to first be introduced and generally understood by others. He traveled to various parts of the USA to establish contacts with like-minded Muslims. A document entitled the Declaration of the Federation of Muslim Communities was issued by imams and Muslim leaders from Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, Akron, Ohio, New York, and Chicago, which would create increased cooperation and coordination and provide foundational principles for Muslims in these various parts of the U.S. This document laid the foundation of what became the Islamic Party in North America. In December 1971, the concept of the Islamic Party was developed. Imam Muzaffaruddin sent out an invitation to the Muslims he knew in various cities to come to D.C. with the purpose of forming a national movement. On December 31, 1971, these plans materialized and the Islamic Party was established. Around this time, Najib Abdul Haq, Imam Muzaffaruddin's most trusted advisor until his death from leukemia in 1991 in Honduras, embraced Islam. The party experienced a period of rapid growth in the country, with branches in different cities in its early stage. In 1978, the Islamic Party in North America changed its name to the Islamic People's Movement as they expanded their work in the Americas, St. Croix, Barbados, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, Dominica, and other places. Due to strong government opposition faced by the Islamic People's Movement, particularly in Dominica, most members moved back to the USA in 1984. Islamic Party was based on all the components one can think of for a movement. It had a syllabus-based educational tarbiyah program for its members. A large number of young adults embraced Islam and joined the party. It had a written constitution as a national organization. It established its bases in various countries in the Americas, established a credit union and other business entities, established Majid and full-time schools throughout the Americas. The first Cleveland mosque, a Sunni mosque, was founded in 1937. It's one of the oldest Muslim institutions in the United States. Originally founded in 1929 as an Ahmadiyya mosque, it was established as a Sunni mosque in 1937 by Al-Hajj Imam Wali Akram, an African-American Muslim engineer. The first Cleveland mosque was also the first Orthodox mosque in the country to be run entirely by African Americans. Imam Wali Akram, born Walter Reese Gregg in Caldwell, Texas on August 4, 1904, was introduced to Islam in the early 1920s. He was one of the early African American Muslims introduced to Islam through the Ahmadiyya movement, but without passing through Moorish science or the Nation of Islam. He remained the leader of the mosque until 1984. Imam Wali Akram was a thought leader, prolific missionary, and a writer. He developed the Muslim 10-year plan, a proposal to address the economic and social needs of African American Muslims during the Great Depression. To unite all Muslims in America, he toured the United States in 1943 to lay the groundwork for the United Islamic Society of North America. Imam Wali Akram was the first known African American to perform the Hajj when he did so in 1957. Imam Wali Akram was a Muslim pioneer in the African American community during the first quarter of the 20th century into the last quarter of that century. His Muslim 10-year plan was a monumental document suggesting a network of cooperative ventures that could potentially relieve the suffering consequent from the Great Depression and the systematic exclusion of blacks from quality of life. Imam Wali Akram was also a model of stability and sustainability over decades during the height of racial animosity against African Americans. His bold vision of national Muslim unity in the 1940s was unparalleled at the time. Mohammed Ezaldeen, born in 1886 and passed away in 1957. Mohammed Ezaldeen was a Pennsylvania native and an early member of the Moorish Science Temple in Newark, New Jersey. He had a master's degree in English and was an elementary school principal, earning him the title of professor. In 1929, during the power struggle between Noble Drew Ali and Claude Green, Ezaldeen went to Egypt where he spent several years learning Arabic and studying Islam. Upon his return from Egypt, he disassociated himself from the temple and launched an organization based on the true teachings of Islam. The organization was called Adanu Allahi Universal Arabic Association, or AAUAA. The AAUAA soon established its units in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Buffalo. The AAUAA offered courses on the Quran, the Sunnah, the Hamitic, or Black Arab heritage, and the Arabic language. Professor Ezaldeen strongly believed in the physical separation of Muslims from the non-Muslims within the context of the concept of hijrah. In 1938, he led his followers to incorporate the community of Jabul Arabiya in West Valley, New York. Another one was formed in the rural area of New Jersey outside Philadelphia, later known as Ezaldeen Village. Other units were located in Youngstown, Rochester, Jacksonville, and Detroit. Each unit was expected to follow the pursuit of West Valley. In 1943, Ezaldeen joined Wali Akram, a former Ahmadi Muslim American and founder of the Sunni Muslim Mosque, First Cleveland Mosque, to unite Sunni African American Muslims around a common agenda. Differences of opinion between Imam Wali Akram and Professor Ezaldeen on matters of religion, dawah methodology, and community development, however, curtailed the organization's progress, slowly dissolving by 1946. Professor Ezaldeen was one of the nation's foremost early proponents of African American Muslims, gaining fluency and proficiency in the Arabic language. Adults and children in his movement developed outstanding Arabic language skills. He established a national Muslim organization with branches throughout the Northeast. Professor Ezaldeen convinced hundreds of African American Muslim families to withdraw from the Islamic environments of the country's inner cities, and to establish land-based communities in rural areas where they could more easily learn the religion of Islam and implement its practice uninhibited. Professor Ezaldeen demonstrated the feasibility of establishing land-based Muslim communities in rural areas in the country. The current status of these communities need further work and research. The author has only come to know of one community located in the suburbs of Buffalo, New York, based on their website. The following is taken from that site. Guided by the visionary leadership of Professor Mohammed Ezaldeen, the association took a monumental stride by purchasing a sprawling 300-plus acre plot of land, strategically located 38 miles from Buffalo. This acquisition was a resolute response to the need for a safe haven, where Muslims could practice their faith free from the shackles of racism and social injustices prevailing in the dominant society. This marked the inception of the Jabul Arabiya community. In 1941, a significant migration, hijra, of Muslims from urban centers commenced, drawn to this sacred land where faith could flourish unhindered. Imam Satti Majid Muhammad, 1883 to 1963. Imam Satti Majid was a pivotal leader in establishing Islam as an organized religion during the 1920s. It is estimated that in his time, there were about 100,000 Muslims without a single masjid or a national organization. He established a number of Muslim societies and converted a significant number of African Americans, including Sheikh Daoud Ahmed Faisal. He primarily worked in New York City, Buffalo, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. Satti Majid was born in Al-Gadar in Old Dongola in 1883. His father was from the Ya-Rabb section of the Dahmashiya Bidairiyah and a member of a well-known Sudanese holy family, the Suwar al-Dahab. He came to New York City in 1904 at the age of 21. Before coming to America, he went to England and founded an Islamic missionary society, Jama'iyat lil-Tabshir Bideen al-Islam. He established 4 Islamic organizations in America at different times. In this pre-World War I era, he was contemporary to Ottoman Empire embassy officials, Drew Ali, and the Ahmadiyya movement. In New York, in part, he acted as a caretaker of immigrant Arab and Indian Muslims coming to America. Learning about Drew Ali and his movement, Imam Satti tried to present true Islam to Drew Ali, wrote about it in the media. He urged Drew Ali to both change his name and burn his so-called revelation. In 1929, he traveled to Al-Azhar, Khartoum, and Omdurman and obtained fatwas against Drew Ali and his teachings. He apparently did not return to the USA from those trips. While abroad, he did continue to communicate with his American followers and was thus instrumental in the development and shaping of new and emerging Muslim groups in America. Imam Satti returned to the Sudan sometime in the 1940s and died there on March 17, 1963. Although heterodox movements of Drew Ali and Elijah Muhammad remained numerically stronger than Imam Satti's efforts, his efforts were critical for the expansion of Orthodox Islam in the United States. Organizational membership in the Moorish Scientist Temple and the Nation of Islam has been on a steady decline, while the number of Orthodox Muslims has mushroomed over the decades since the 1930s. Imam Satti's contributions and successes. First, Imam Satti gathered scattered Muslims into congregations and thus started and organized Islam in America. Second, he introduced Islam and challenged heretical movements at the very outset. Third, he brought immigrant and African Muslims together. Sheikh Daoud Ahmed Faisal, 1891 to 1980. Sheikh Daoud was born in Grenada and came to America as a music student around the time of World War I. He was a contemporary of people like Noble Drew Ali and Fard Muhammad. Sheikh Daoud was influenced by a Sudanese scholar, Satti Majid, who came to New York City in 1904 at the age of 21. Satti Majid's efforts were aimed to nurture Islam in North America. In the 1920s, Islam and African American communities were heavily influenced by the Ahmadiyya movement, Black American jazz musicians, and the Black Arts movement. In New York City, the oldest Sunni Muslim houses of worship, Brooklyn's Islamic Mission of America, founded by the Sheikh in 1939, attracted many of the musicians that made up Brooklyn's legendary jazz scene. The mosque was attended by a growing community of skilled musicians, including the bassist and oud player Ahmed Abdul Malik, the trombonist Haj Daoud Haroun, and the trumpeter Rajab Abdul Wahab. Sheikh Daoud worked to bring immigrant Muslims, including Indians and Arabs, as well as new American converts to the faith together in one mosque under the Islamic mission. Sheikh Daoud was also a muqaddim, or representative, of the Algerian Sufi Sheikh Ahmad al-Alawi. He was a frequent participant in United Nations events and was, until the 1960s, considered to be the representative of America's Muslims at the United Nations. Sheikh Daoud may have brought well over 10,000 Americans to Islam before 1959. The Islamic mission in America was a source of Sunni Islam throughout the 1920s and 1930s, and remained so for the rest of the century. Over time, the fraternal atmosphere at the State Street Mosque degenerated into two thinly disguised factions: the New Americans, Arab Muslim immigrants, and the New Muslims, African American converts. Dar-ul-Islam was the result of this degeneration, and was founded by the members of the Mission for the African American Muslims. Broad tolerance and acceptance of multiculturalism may keep Muslims together. Its failure may result in disunity and degeneration. Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, is one of the most iconic figures of the 20th century and arguably the most influential Muslim born on American soil. His body of work continues to resonate with millions of people worldwide, both Muslims and non-Muslims. The number of African Americans who were influenced to explore and embrace Islam because of Malcolm's example is countless. Malcolm Little was born to activist parents, Earl and Louise Little. The couple met in Toronto, Canada, where they were active in race matters. Both were active and held leadership positions in various chapters of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. As a child, young Malcolm often traveled with his father to Union meetings, where he would hear his father expound on Garvey's philosophy of pride in one's African heritage, economic, social self-sufficiency for Black people, and Africa for the Africans. After a series of traumatic childhood experiences, including the murder of his father by racist whites in Omaha, Nebraska, and the institutionalization of his mother, Malcolm moved to Boston to live with his sister, Ella Collins. Malcolm's stay in Boston and New York resulted in his getting involved in street hustles and burglary rings that eventually landed him in prison for 8 years. While in prison, Malcolm accepted the heterodox teachings of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. Malcolm was released from prison and moved to Detroit to live with his brother, who was also a member of the Nation. Malcolm was such an energetic, articulate recruiter for the organization that he was soon elevated to the position of national spokesman for Elijah Muhammad and national minister for the group. He was responsible for the explosive growth of the organization, tirelessly traveling across the country, opening temples and recruiting new members. His rapid rise in the Nation caused jealousy among the group members, particularly members of Elijah Muhammad's family. Malcolm was silenced by Elijah Muhammad in November 1963 for making comments against Elijah's instructions about the assassination of President John Kennedy. On March 8, 1964, Malcolm announced in a press conference that he was no longer a member of the Nation of Islam and that he was forming another organization, Muslim Mosque, Inc. In April 1964, Malcolm left to perform Hajj. He was a guest of then Prince Faisal. Malcolm traveled throughout the Middle East and Africa, where he met with heads of state and leaders of liberation movements before returning to the United States. When he returned to the U.S. in June 1964, he announced the formation of Organization of Afro-American Unity, named after the Organization of African Unity. While the Muslim Mosque, Inc. was exclusively for Muslims, the OAU was open to people of all faiths or no faith. During the 11 months from the time he left the nation and his martyrdom on February 21, 1965, Malcolm illuminated the path for millions to embrace Islam. Malcolm was evolving politically and religiously at a rapid pace before his assassination. He was granted ijazah by sheikhs in Saudi Arabia to give dawah in the United States. Al-Azhar University in Cairo gave Malcolm 20 scholarships for African Americans to study there. Malik Shabazz is a transcendent figure that the American Muslim community has just started to understand and appreciate his significance as an American Islamic movement visionary. Some of Malcolm's greatest contributions were his incomparable attributes of sincerity to his beliefs, truth-telling, even to tyrants, loyalty, and single-mindedness to Islamic movement in all its manifestations. Malcolm was gifted with the understanding that Islam is an organic whole that consists of adherence to guidance in all aspects of human endeavor and not just acts of ibadah. Malcolm's uncompromising stance for truth, Harken back to the first generation of Muslims who preferred martyrdom than a life living on their knees. Malcolm's example provided generations of young people, including Muslim youth, a counter-narrative to the social change modality of peace at all costs, and going along to get along. Malcolm's life demonstrated that there can be no peace in the absence of justice, and that justice comes from righteous struggle. If we view Malcolm's life resume only from his 11 months of practicing Islam as outlined in the Quran and Sunnah of the Arabian prophet Muhammad ibn Abdullah, peace be on him, there is very little that can be characterized as a failure. He was offered sanctuary and jobs in Ghana and other African nations if he decided not to return to live in the United States. But Malcolm's commitment to spreading true Islam in America and the liberation of black people in this country was so great that he refused to try to secure his personal safety at the expense of his fulfilling the mission that he was charged with by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.